I have walked through nights where the only sound was the echo of my own unanswered prayers. I have laid awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the sky was just an empty, silent canvas. Do you know that feeling? The one where you speak to the darkness and no one answers back? The one where your faith feels like a thin thread about to snap and you're afraid to pull on it too hard? I've held on to promises that now feel like dust, like they were whispered in a dream I can no longer remember. I thought I knew what it was to trust, but this is a different kind of trust. The kind that stands on the edge of a cliff, looking down into an abyss of silence and still says, I believe. But what if the silence is the answer? What if the absence is a presence I just can't feel yet? What if he is here, in the quiet, in the ache, in the tears that you have been holding back? What if you are about to cry, not because of the pain, but because of the one who has been holding you through it all? It started with a whisper, a soft, gentle call that felt like a secret between me and God. It was a promise of purpose, a path laid out just for me, clear as the morning light, and for a time, it was all I could see. I walked in the light of that promise, my heart overflowing with a certainty that seemed unshakable. I spoke of it, prayed over it, built my life around it. I was so sure, so absolutely convinced that I was on the right track. And then the path disappeared. Not in a dramatic, thunderous way, but slowly. The light faded, the clarity blurred. The promises that once felt like rock-solid ground began to crumble beneath my feet, piece by fragile piece. I remember the day it truly hit me. I was sitting in my car, the rain pouring down outside, matching the storm inside my soul. I had just received another rejection, another closed door, another no that felt like a direct contradiction to the yes I had heard from God years before. I sat there, the sound of the rain so loud it filled the world, and I just screamed. Not with my voice, but with my soul. I screamed a question into the void. Why? Why did you show me this? Why did you promise this if it was never going to happen? My knuckles were white on the steering wheel. The silent sobs turned into guttural cries. It wasn't just about the disappointment of a dream deferred. It was the gut-wrenching pain of feeling abandoned, like I had been left on a shore to watch a ship sail away that I was promised a seat on. I looked at my hands and remembered the times I had held them up in worship, in fervent prayer, believing that he was moving, that he was working behind the scenes. And in that moment, those memories felt like a cruel joke. I felt small, foolish, and deeply, utterly alone. All the sermons about his faithfulness, all the verses about his promises, they all seemed to belong to someone else's story, not mine. My story was becoming a tragedy of unfulfilled promises. I felt like a child who had built a magnificent sandcastle only to watch the tide come in and wash it away, grain by grain. And where was the father who was supposed to be watching over me, protecting my heart from the waves? Where was he? The days that followed were a blur of motions. I went to work, I smiled at people, I went through the motions of prayer, but my heart was a barren wasteland. Every morning felt heavier than the one before. My faith, once so vibrant and alive, was now a fragmented mosaic of questions and doubts. Did I hear you wrong? I'd whisper to myself. Was it all just my imagination? Am I just not good enough to receive this promise? Have I done something wrong? The whispers of the enemy became loud shouts in my mind, telling me that I was unworthy, unloved, forgotten. That my prayers were just empty words echoing in the silence of an indifferent universe. I started to withdraw from friends, from community, even from the Bible. I couldn't bear to read another verse about God's faithfulness because it felt like a painful reminder of what I felt was missing from my own life. I began to feel a deep sense of betrayal, not just from my circumstances, but from God Himself, the one I had trusted above all others, the one who was supposed to be my constant, my rock, my refuge, seemed to have turned his back. The quiet was deafening. The stillness felt like an empty tomb. It was the lowest I had ever been. The silence of God was not a quiet peacefulness. It was a roaring void that swallowed my hope. And yet, deep, deep down, a tiny ember of something remained. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper in my spirit that refused to be extinguished. It was the memory of that first whisper, that initial promise. It was the quiet, persistent thought. What if there's more to the story? I knew, intellectually, that the best stories always have a dark, difficult chapter, but living in the middle of a story where the hero seems to have disappeared and the villain is winning, that is a different kind of pain. This was not a test of my strength, but of my dependence on a God who seemed to be absent. And as the darkness deepened, I knew I had to find Him again, not in the mountaintop experiences of the past, but in the valley of the shadow of death I was walking through. The emptiness wasn't just a feeling. It was a physical weight on my chest. It felt like my soul had been scooped out, and all that was left was a hollow, echoing chamber. My prayers became less and less like conversations, and more like desperate, broken pleas. I would just sit and repeat His name. Jesus. Jesus! Jesus! Hoping that saying it would somehow summon Him, that the sound of His name might break through the static in my heart. But the silence remained. The hollow feeling persisted. It was as if I was praying into a locked box with no key. I started to compare my life to others, to see people who seemed to have it all, who were walking in their purpose, whose prayers were being answered with visible, tangible miracles. And I would ask, what makes them so different from me, God? Am I not worth that kind of attention? The Bible said that He hears the cries of the righteous, but I felt like I was screaming and the heavens remained sealed. I started to believe the lie that God was tired of me, that I had exhausted His patience with my questions and my doubts. Maybe I was too broken. Maybe my faith was too weak. Maybe I was just not a good enough Christian to receive what I had been promised. The enemy's voice grew louder, more convincing. "Look at you," it would hiss. "You're trying so hard, and for what? He's not coming. He's not going to show up. This is your life now, a series of disappointments and closed doors. You are on your own." One night, I found myself in a moment of utter desperation. I was on the floor, the cold tile a stark contrast to the burning pain inside me. I gripped my pillow and screamed into it until my throat was raw. I shouted, but the heavens remained silent. The words of the Psalms, once a comfort, now felt like an accusation. They testified to a God who listened, who rescued, who delivered. But my experience was a testimony of absence. My reality was a God who was hiding. The loneliness was so strong that I truly thought, maybe God has grown weary of me. The very thought was a poison, seeping into the deepest parts of my soul. It was a rejection so profound, a feeling of abandonment so complete, that I felt like I was breaking apart. I had always been able to find comfort in Scripture, but now, the words on the page felt like a foreign language. The Bible said He hears, so why does it feel like He has hidden Himself from me? I would ask, my voice a broken whisper. The crisis of faith was not a sudden event, but a slow erosion. It was the daily chipping away of hope. It was the cumulative weight of small disappointments. The job I didn't get, the friendship that fell apart, the prayers that went unanswered. It all added up to a mountain of evidence that God had forgotten me. I felt like a character in a story who had been forgotten by the author. The pages were blank and there was no one to write the next chapter. And so, I was left to wander in the wilderness of my own thoughts, with no direction, no map, and no sense of a destination. Every step was heavy. Every breath was a struggle. It was a spiritual desert, and I was dying of thirst. But in the midst of this desolate wasteland, a flicker, a memory of a single moment. I had been driving aimlessly, the radio on, and a song came on. Not a Christian song, not a worship song, but one with lyrics that spoke of a deep, abiding love that endures even when you feel you don't deserve it. It was just a small thing, a fleeting moment of an unfamiliar sense of peace that cut through the turmoil. It was so subtle, so easily dismissed as a coincidence. But for a fraction of a second, it was a hint of a presence, a warmth in the cold. It wasn't a booming voice or a visible miracle, just a gentle, almost imperceptible reminder that love still existed, that it wasn't a fairy tale. It was a seed of hope, a microscopic grain of faith planted in the most unlikely of places. It was a tiny crack in the dam of my despair, a subtle sign that perhaps, just perhaps, I wasn't as alone as I thought I was. The tension was still there, the struggle was still real, but now there was a whisper, an echo from the other side of the silence, a soft hint that maybe, just maybe, I was being held in a way I couldn't see. It was in the dead of the night, when the house was completely silent, that I began to feel it. Not a sound, not a voice, but a presence. It was a stillness that was different from the empty silence I had been experiencing. This stillness had weight. It had substance. It was like the air in the room was being held by something or someone. I didn't feel a big, dramatic shift. There was no thunder or blinding light, just a quiet, all-encompassing peace that settled over me. A peace that had no business being there. It didn't make the pain go away. The ache was still real, but it was being held. It was being cradled by something greater than myself. And in that moment, I understood a truth that words could not capture. Sometimes the silence of God is the sound of something being healed within us. I started to notice the small things. The sun shining through my window in the morning, a sudden beautiful arrangement of clouds in the sky, the simple act of breathing in and out. These were things I had taken for granted, things I had not even registered in my despair. Now they felt like breadcrumbs being left for me on a path I thought was gone. I wasn't hearing his voice in a booming way, but I was seeing his hand in the most ordinary of moments, a kindness from a stranger. A phone call from a friend I hadn't spoken to in months. A song lyric that suddenly held new meaning. These weren't grand gestures. They were quiet, subtle whispers. They were God saying, "I am here. I never left." I remember a day when I was particularly overwhelmed with a sense of failure. I was reading the book of Job, a book I had always avoided because it felt too close to home. I was just turning the pages, not really reading, when my eyes fell on a single verse. Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. Job 13:15. The words hit me like a physical blow. It was a verse I had read 100 times before, but in that moment, it was not just a verse. It was a lifeline. It was a confession of faith spoken from a place of unimaginable pain. And I realized that Job didn't trust God because God was answering him. He trusted God in the face of absolute, crushing silence. And in that moment, I found a new way to pray. Not by demanding answers, but by confessing my trust in the middle of my pain. It was in my worst moment that he drew near without saying a word. That's what it felt like. His presence wasn't about solving all my problems. It was about holding me in the middle of them. It was about his quiet companionship in the darkness. I started to understand that his silence was not a sign of his absence, but a form of his care. He wasn't giving me answers because what I needed was deeper than an answer. I needed a healing that went down to the roots of my soul. And that kind of healing often happens in stillness, in quietness, away from the noise and the distractions. I had been so focused on the external circumstances, the closed doors, the unanswered prayers, that I had missed the internal work he was doing. He was tending to my wounds, stitching up my fragmented faith, and rebuilding my trust, not with grand miracles, but with small, gentle whispers of his presence. I began to see that the promised land I had been so desperately chasing was not a place, but a person. And that person was with me, even in the desert. The silence wasn't a wall between us. It was a sacred space where the most intimate and profound work was taking place. The shift was not a sudden earthquake, but a quiet, dawning light. It was the realization that the silence I had so feared was actually the sound of divine care. The stillness was not abandonment, but an embrace. I had been so busy listening for a yes to my specific requests that I had missed the yes of his abiding presence. The desert I had walked through, the place of my greatest pain and loneliness, was not a punishment, but a sanctuary. It was the place where everything I thought I knew about God was stripped away, leaving only the essential, the true. The absence I had felt was in reality a profound protection. He was protecting me from the shallow answers I had been asking for and giving me the deep, transformative healing I had been starving for. He wasn't answering me with words because he was answering me with himself. I began to see my journey not as a failure, but as a testament. My unfulfilled dreams were not a sign of God's rejection, but an invitation into a deeper, more intimate relationship with Him. The pain was not a waste. It was the sacred ground where He had met me in my lowest moment. The silence was not a void, but a whisper. And the whisper said, "I have never left you. I was with you the whole time." I had thought I was fighting alone, but now I could see His hand holding mine. I could feel His presence, not as a thunderous command, but as a gentle guiding force. The faith that had been so fragmented was now being pieced back together, not into a rigid, perfect structure, but into a beautiful, mosaic-like faith, full of the scars and the cracks of my journey. It was a faith that was not based on what I received, but on who He is. And so, my prayer changed. No longer a list of demands, it became a confession, a conversation, a tearful surrender. I knelt down, a flood of emotions finally breaking through, and I spoke to Him, not in polished religious words, but from the depths of my soul. "Oh God, I have been so angry. I have felt so abandoned. I confess that my faith has been so small, so dependent on what I could see and what I could feel. I am so sorry for all the times I doubted you, for all the times I ran away. But God, even in the anger, even in the doubt, even in the silence, you were here. You were with me. Thank you. Thank you for not answering me the way I wanted, because you were doing something so much deeper, so much more profound. Thank you for the pain, because it was the only thing that could lead me to this place. Thank you for the silence, because it was in the quiet that I finally heard your heart. I don't understand everything. I don't know what comes next, but I believe. Still, I believe. Even though it hurts, I believe. Even though it's not what I expected, I believe. Jesus, I give you my broken faith, my fragile hope, my desperate heart. Don't let go of my hand, never let go. This was not the end of the journey, but the beginning of a new way of walking. A way of walking by faith, not by sight. A way of trusting not in the answers, but in the answerer. The silence had not been an absence, but a preparation. The desert had not been a dead end, but a classroom. The pain had not been pointless, but a pathway to a deeper intimacy. And I now know that if God is silent, perhaps it is because He is healing something that words cannot reach. If this story spoke to the deepest part of you, if you have been walking in a season of silence, if you have been praying with tears you can't hold back anymore, then this is your moment. In the comments, share a piece of your heart. Type, "God, meet me in this silence." Or if the pain is so deep you can barely whisper, just say, "Still hurting, I believe." Or perhaps your cry is for a connection that won't break. Jesus, don't let go of my hand. And if this message felt like a whispered answer to your prayer, subscribe, because every new video here could be the word your soul has been waiting to hear. And please, if you know someone who is praying in silence, who feels forgotten by God, send them this video. It might be the breath of life they need to keep going.